Thank you, Brother Briggs. First and foremost, I want to thank Brother Briggs and Sahuaro Lodge for allowing me to come here. I don't know why you guys would want Florida Man in Arizona, but now Florida Man is here, and I appreciate that. I'm very happy about that. Also, I want to thank you all for allowing me to talk or to give this lecture on two topics that are very important to my life and have been very important to my life for a long time. Obviously, Freemasonry. I'm a Freemason, but also Stoicism. To give you a little bit of preamble as to how I developed this lecture, in 2020, I was elected Worshipful Master of my lodge. And as we all know, we went through a pandemic that year, right? So it was very difficult. I was also 26 years old, right? So I was 26, Worshipful Master of my lodge, and I'm thinking to myself, wow, I'm sitting in a very powerful chair. And I'm looking at individuals that, are much older than me, much more successful than me. What could they possibly have to learn from me? And it was in developing this lecture that I was actually humbled, just because at that moment they were ready to learn from me as much as I have been ready to learn from them. It's very interesting because during that time, Freemasonry and Stoicism were on a rise. There were actual statistics that were released showing that while people were closed indoors, they were picking up Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. For whatever reason, they were all gravitating to Stoicism to find self-empowerment in a time that obviously we had no idea what was going to happen. People were also gravitating to Freemasonry because it was at that moment that we were all sent home that a lot of Masonic lecturers took to the online, right, to Zoom, to be able to provide these lectures. And it was amazing to be a part of that because there were a lot of lecturers and brothers that I otherwise would have probably never met that I had the pleasure of meeting just because we were able to attend these Zoom meetings, listen to these lectures, ask these questions, and develop friendships that to this day, we've become best friends in a lot of cases. This is just a little bit of preamble just to let you know of how I developed this presentation. So I decided to develop this lecture just to make sense of everything that I was understanding. And as I was just telling a brother earlier today, this is a presentation that I continue to change every time that I give this lecture, just because I always ask that there be a Q&A section, because if there's a question that I cannot answer, it only lets me know that I have more homework to do. So it's always very exciting to get to that portion. So without further ado, I give to you Hiramic Meditations, How Freemasonry Crafts a Stoic Lifestyle. So let's go over a little bit of what we're going to be discussing this evening. We're going to be discussing, we're going to be setting some ground rules, right? First, I'm going to introduce to you three important Stoic thinkers. Now, whenever I talk about Stoicism and I say Stoicism argues this, Stoicism says this, we are talking about an age-old school of philosophy. We have the Old Stoa, the Middle Stoa, and the Late Stoa. As the school of thought has progressed, we have had different individuals that have been the heads of the school. They have injected their views and their opinions, which has kind of changed the main argument, but there are some arguments that have persisted, right? So we can find these arguments that are still unifying them. And the three Stoic thinkers that I'm going to talk about today are Zeno, who is considered the forefather of Stoicism, the founder of Stoicism. We're going to look into Epictetus, who is the slave of our story. And then finally, we're going to discuss a little bit of Marcus Aurelius' life, or the last of the 5 great emperors of Rome. Next, we're going to look at some connections between Stoicism and Freemasonry, just for us to be able to draw a bridge from the thinkers to now looking at Stoicism and Freemasonry and the arguments that they make. And then we're going to look at 6 Stoic concepts that are found in Freemasonry. One is the concept of cosmopolitanism. The second one is the concept of premeditatio malorum, which is the premeditation of evils. The third one is self-control practice, so Stoic self-control practice as it's explored in Freemasonry. Next, the concept of amor fati, or loving your fate. Next, memento mori, which I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with, right? Knowing your mortality, knowing that you're going to die. And then finally, we're going to look at how the Stoic act of journaling might play a role in our Masonic lives. We'll end with some concluding remarks, and then hopefully we'll have some questions to explore. So first, our story begins 300 years before the birth of Jesus Christ. And we start with Zeno. Zeno is the merchant of our story. And his story is told in the Lives and Opinions of Eminent Philosophers by Diogenes Laertius. Unfortunately, much of Zeno's publications have not survived. We only have a couple of his fragments left, and we only really have his story or his life as it's told in this book. At 22 years old, Zeno had taken up after his father. His father was a merchant. Zeno had taken on after him and had become a merchant of different spices and different dyes. Unfortunately, at that time, he became shipwrecked in Athens. And shortly after he became shipwrecked, he is said to have visited an oracle because he was questioning what it was that he was placing value in his life. He was questioning what he was applying meaning to and if he was living a life that was actually fulfilling or satisfying. And he is said to have visited an oracle, and he asked the oracle what it was that he needed to do in order to live a meaningful life, in order to live the best life. And we're told that the oracle told him that what he needed to do, what the gods told him that he needed to do, was to adopt the complexion of the dead. And he contemplated on that because he had no idea what that meant. What do you mean to adopt the complexion of the dead? And the conclusion that he arrived to was that he needed to study philosophy. He needed to study the great thinkers of the time. That's exactly what he did. He started reading as much as he could, frequenting bookshops, and it was upon reading Xenophon's Memorabilia, which is on Socrates, it's apologetics of Socrates, that he came to the conclusion that he needed to emulate this individual. This is the person that he wanted to model his life after. So he walked up to the bookseller and he told the bookseller, I need to find an individual like this, or I need to find individuals like this. Where can I find people like this? And it said that at that time, outside of the bookshop, Crates of Thebes, who was a prominent Cynic philosopher, had just passed by. And the bookseller told him, that's the individual that you need to go after. So he ran after him, asked Crates if he could take him under his wing, if he could be a student of his, and Crates agreed. And it was after that that he started learning of the different philosophical schools, right? And he got to a point where he said, I know as much as I need to know. Now I can be a teacher. Now I must assume the role of being a teacher. And this is where we arrive at the school of thought that at the time was called Zenoism. Why? Because it was named after him, right? Fortunately, as I mentioned already, a lot of his works haven't survived. We only have different fragments. It is said that he had written a book called Zeno's Republic, which was modeled after Plato's Republic, except that it explored a world that was governed by Stoic principles. This is very interesting to see how that would have played out. But he started teaching this philosophy in a place called the Stoa Poikile, right, which is known as the painted porch. And it's also interesting to note that now when we talk about somebody being a Stoic, we usually have this misconception of this person is devoid of emotions, this person is not showing emotions. And at the time, the ones that were referred to as Stoics were actually the poets and the musicians, right? And later on, when we talk about the Stoic becoming a sage, which is very similar to the process of an initiate becoming a master mason, some Stoics actually argue that the greatest sages of our times are the poets and the musicians because they are fashioning our passions and our desires, right? Instead of, what the Stoics say is that the passions take us here and there, but reason is the one that should be guiding the way. So it's interesting just to keep that in mind. But ultimately, Zenoism becomes Stoicism because he is teaching at the Stoa Poikile. And as a school of thought, Stoicism ends up dealing with combating negative emotions and enhancing the self-development of the individual. Now, I tried my best to find a great illustration of the Stoa Poikile. Unfortunately, I have not been able to find one, so I leave you all with a rendition from the game Assassin's Creed Odyssey. So if any of you are video gamers, there you go. You've probably seen that before. But that is how it's seen in the game, right? The Stoa Poikile was called the painted porch because around the Stoa, there were illustrations of the greatest figures of that time that were displaying and exemplifying heroic acts. They were living lives of virtue. And obviously, as we'll see, Stoicism, the virtues play a great deal in an individual being a Stoic and eventually becoming a sage. So this is one of the reasons why we believe that he ultimately chose to teach at the Stoa, in the painted porch. It's also interesting to note that the Stoa was reported to have been used for an annual celebration of the Eleusinian mysteries. So if you're interested in some of the old mystery schools, it's also cool to know that there's a possibility that that was used to celebrate the Eleusinian mysteries. How those celebrations went, I don't know, right? But it's cool to think about that. These are some illustrations that you could have found at the Stoa, right? So the reconstitution of the Battle of Marathon depicted in the Stoa Poikile right there. And then these are the ruins of the Stoa as we can see them today. Now next we move to Epictetus. Epictetus and the dichotomy. And Epictetus is the slave of our story. Now in 50 AD, Epictetus was born into slavery in Hierapolis, Phrygia, which is present-day Pamukkale, Turkey. And Epictetus actually isn't even his real name. Epictetus just translates to acquired. So we don't really know what his name is because unfortunately he was born into slavery. However, he had permission from Epaphroditus, who was a wealthy freedman and the secretary to Nero, the individual that he was a slave for. And Epaphroditus actually gave him permission to study Stoicism under one of the greatest tutors of Stoicism at the time, Musonius Rufus. Now, it was after Nero's death in 68 AD that Epictetus became freed, and he followed in the same footsteps as Zeno. He said that what he wanted to do was he wanted to become a teacher. He wanted to teach Stoicism. That's exactly what he ended up doing. Now, Epictetus was very similar to Socrates in that he believed that he didn't have to write anything down, right? The way that he was able to transmit his message was orally or through lectures, but he had a devout student of his called Arian who believed that Epictetus was just as important to society and philosophy as Socrates was. And it's because of Arian that we have many of the texts of Epictetus today. So we have the discourses of Epictetus, as we can already tell, discourses, they're the lectures that Arian had written down. But then there's also another text called the Enchiridion, or the Enchiridion of Epictetus. Now, Enchiridion just translates to the handbook, right? And what that handbook is a book of 52 different aphorisms, right, or sayings that are attributed to Epictetus. And it's in the first aphorism that we arrive at the argument that now we use to define Stoicism. As I mentioned already, Stoicism has, if you do your research, it's gone through many different arguments, many different areas of study, but now what we attribute it to is more ethical living a life of virtue, right? And it is in the first aphorism that Epictetus teaches us that some things are in our control and other things are not in our control, right? And what that aphorism is known as is the dichotomy of control. Next, we have Marcus Aurelius and the Meditations. So Marcus Aurelius is the emperor of our story. Marcus Aurelius was born Marcus Aurelius Antoninus Augustus in Rome in 121 AD. Shortly after, he was adopted by his grandfather in 124 AD after his father passed away. At the age of 17, Emperor Hadrian grew fond of Marcus Aurelius, and he even called him Verissimus, which means true and faithful. And what the emperor said was that he envisioned that Marcus Aurelius was going to succeed him in the throne, right? At 17. Now, at the request of Hadrian, there was a man called Titus Aurelius Antoninus who adopted Marcus Aurelius after his own grandfather had passed away. When Hadrian himself died in 138 AD, Titus, the man that had adopted Marcus Aurelius, took over the throne as emperor. And then in 161 AD, when Titus passed away, Marcus ascended to the throne so we can say that the prophecy was fulfilled. Now, it is in the years that he served as the emperor of Rome where he wrote what we now know of as the Meditations, or what we've heard of as the Meditations. As he was writing it, the book was initially called To Thyself, because it essentially was just different journal entries where he was questioning, right, or exploring the several questions that even we as Masons might ask ourselves on a daily basis. What is the nature of the universe? What is our relationship to society? What is our relationship with ourselves, right? What is the higher meaning in life? And these were the things that he was exploring. If you haven't had the chance to read the book, I highly suggest that you do. It's essentially a book of 12 different journals, or 12 different books. And in the first book, what he essentially spends his entire time doing is just thanking the people around him for having taught him something, whether intentionally or unintentionally, right? So very beautiful to see that. And another beautiful thing is that one of the biggest influences in his life in wanting to pursue a life of philosophy, right? He didn't want to be a philosopher, but he was interested in studying philosophy. And his biggest influence was Epictetus, who was a slave, right? And this is a beautiful thing when it comes to Stoicism, where if you look at the history, you look at the school has progressed, you see that it includes many different people from many different backgrounds, many different walks through life, which obviously is very similar to Freemasonry. So that's just something very interesting to note, that you have, at this point, the most important individual, right, in society at that time, and his greatest influence, you know, his mentor, his hero, is Epictetus, who was considered a slave. Now next, I do understand that there are some who are interested in Freemasonry, right, who are interested in joining the fraternity. So I always just introduce this slide just to give you some information as to what Freemasonry is, and as we will be speaking it today. When we were talking about speculative Freemasonry, the reason why we are speculative is because we take our traditions from the operative Freemasons, or the ones that actually built the temples, right? Albert Gallatin Mackey tells us that operative Freemasonry is, quote, engaged in the application of the rules and principles of architecture to the construction of edifices for private and public use, houses for the dwelling place of man, and temples for the worship of deity. So we have taken our tradition from operative Masons. Now we are speculative Masons, because we are taking those same rules, those same tools, those same lessons, and now we are applying it to our own lives from a speculative or figurative perspective. Now, the elevator pitch, which we've all heard, and which we're told in the Entered Apprentice lecture, is that speculative Freemasonry is, quote, a system of morality veiled in allegory and illustrated by symbols. So while we can view Freemasonry through many different perspectives, in layman's terms, in its most basic form, it is a form, a philosophy of a more ethical living a virtuous life, right? And the Blue Lodge degrees, which is what we're here for, is split up into 3 different degrees. We have the Entered Apprentice degree, the Fellowcraft degree, and the Master Mason degree. If we can quickly just define all of them, the Entered Apprentice degree gives you an ethical foundation that you can build upon. The Fellowcraft degree is the masonry of the mind, where you are introduced to the 7 liberal arts. And then the Master Mason degree takes on a more spiritual connotation, teaches you about life, death, and the hereafter. So that's just a quick recap of what we're talking about when we're talking about speculative Freemasonry. Now, Freemasonry and Stoicism. So as I was initially developing this presentation, I was able to talk to many different learned brothers and share the work that I was doing, some of the thoughts that I had. And at this time, I was able to communicate with worshipful brother Andreas Onefers. He is a past master of Quater Coronati Lodge number 2076. If you're familiar with Quater Coronati, it is the premier research lodge. And I was talking to him about Stoicism, Freemasonry, some of the philosophical arguments found between them. He asked me if I had read his book, Freemasonry, A Very Short Introduction. At the time, I hadn't. So he was gracious enough to send me a copy of the book, and he said, you should read the book. I think you're going to find some stuff in there that you'll find interesting. And that I did. So one of the things that Worshipful Brother Onifers shares with us in this book, he tells us that, quote, lodges were perceived as something akin to academies, or at least they acted as such in countries that were without scientific societies. The scientific image of Freemasonry gave it a central place in the Enlightenment ideas of the period. Freemasonry is saturated with key Enlightenment concepts such as progress, perfectibility, and cosmopolitanism. On an individual level, Freemasonry aims to promote a morality of autonomy, responsibility for the self, and moral examples. These ideas are heavily influenced by classical Stoicism, which are attaining a strong control of the passions and a mastery of the emotions while facing personal fate and unforeseen challenges. Now, as I've mentioned already, Stoicism involves itself in many different studies that have changed over time. But if we were able to condense Stoicism into 3 specific studies, we have the study of logic, the study of physics, and the study of ethics. Now, what are the arguments that Stoicism makes? When it comes to logic, we're told that knowledge is attained through the use of reason, and that it is the only way that we can gain true comprehension and conviction in our lives. When it comes to the arguments of physics that it makes, we're told that the universe is God, but it is divided into 2 different classes. We have the active class and also the passive class. Now, the passive substance is matter, or the material, and the active substance is what we know of as fate. And then finally, when it comes to ethics, or what we now mostly know Stoicism for, we're told that one must discipline his perception, his action, and his will. Now, the Stoics also express a cosmological argument, and their cosmology describes a quote-unquote craftsman God. And the Stoics argue that everything actually stems from a primordial flame, right? So everything comes from a primordial flame, and in the end, everything will also be consumed by that same primordial flame. This is what they call ekpyrosis, or universal conflagration, right? The Stoics see life as cycles. Comes from the primordial flame, and then ultimately, in the end, it is consumed by it. This cosmology actually derives from the Platonic dialogue Timaeus. Usually the Timaeus and Critias are sent together because they deal with similar themes. But their cosmology comes from this Platonic dialogue. And the Stoics argue that, quote, the cosmos is a single living organism that was created by a benevolent God, the craftsman, or in some cases also been referred to as a demiurge, who wants there to be much goodness and order as possible in the world, which is very interesting because in Freemasonry we also have an archetype of the divine, which we refer to as the grand architect of the universe. There is no specific faith that is represented. It is representative of all the faiths of the members. Now, I was in reading the Bhagavad Gita, which is the central religious text of the Hindu faith, that I came across this introduction from Henry David Thoreau, who was a famous transcendentalist writer. And specifically, the translation is from Barbara Ann Stoller, who's a scholar. And it was in reading his introduction to the Bhagavad Gita that I found it interesting, because I feel that it applies to both the Stoics' journey to ultimately becoming a sage, which we'll discuss later, but then also the initiate's journey in eventually becoming a master mason. Now, Henry David Thoreau says that every man is the builder of a temple, which he calls his body, to the God he worships, after a style purely his own, nor can he get off by hammering marble instead. We're all sculptors and painters, and our material is our own flesh and blood and bones. Any nobleness begins at once to refine a man's features, any meanness or sensuality to imbrue him. Now, this is interesting because much like speculative Freemasonry focuses on the quote-unquote building of the inner spiritual temple, the Stoics also have a similar concept which they call the inner citadel. And the inner citadel is built by cultivating virtues, trying to self-master yourself, right? And it is where reason, right, or where you can go to for refuge, right, against the superfluities of life, and the things that are outside of your control, the externalities of life, right? So it's very interesting to see that they both have similar concepts when it comes to the inner spiritual temple and the inner citadel. So I've mentioned already that the Stoic is on a journey to ultimately become a sage. But what does this mean? The Stoics argued that the goal of life was eudaimonia, which we know of as to live in accordance with nature, capital N nature meaning reason or the divine. When you are living in accordance to nature and you are using reason, it is said that that is how the divine or divinity is communicating to you. We're told that virtue alone is good and the passions must be eradicated to make room for the life of the intellect, or else we do not live a life in accordance with our true nature. In order for you to become a sage, you have attained this level of self-mastery. You have been able to eradicate the passions, right? And you have arrived at the same level, theoretically, right, of being a master mason, who has to also attain the same level of self-mastery. Now, we're told that one who has attained virtue is called a sage. And in order for you to become a sage, you have to do three things. You have to cultivate virtue, you have to become disciplined through self-control practice, and you also have to live in harmony with nature, capital N nature. But it's interesting to note that this same journey of becoming a Stoic, of going from a Stoic to a sage, is similarly represented in the three movable jewels that we are introduced to in the Entered Apprentice degree. Now let's look at the three movable jewels as a narrative, as a story, right? The three movable jewels are the rough ashlar, the perfect ashlar, and the tracing board. The rough ashlar, we are told, represents man in his rude and imperfect state. The perfect ashlar represents that perfected state that we all aspire to get to. And the tracing board, right, is what the master uses to put down his drawings and the designs that then the fellow crafts have to work on in order to build the temple, right? Therefore, us as masons, we have to follow the drawings and the designs of that tracing board in order for us to build our own specific temples, right? And in the Entered Apprentice degree, we are told that in order for you to reach that perfected state and have that perfect ashlar, you have to do three things, right? We can only arrive at that perfected state by having a virtuous education, by our own endeavors, and then also the blessing of God. Now, the four virtues play a prominent role in Stoicism because the Stoic is always trying to cultivate virtue in the same way that the Mason is also trying to cultivate virtue. Now, we are first introduced to these virtues in Book 4 of Plato's Republic. And the four Stoic virtues, as we are taught, are wisdom, justice, courage, and moderation. And the four Masonic cardinal virtues are fortitude, prudence, temperance, and justice. Now, fortitude is the noble purpose of the mind that allows us to overcome any obstacle. Prudence is the regulation of our lives in accordance to reason. Temperance is the restraint that we develop to not allow ourselves to become governed by vices. And justice is the ability to give every person their just due with no distinction. Now, Ludwig Edelstein, who is a scholar of Stoicism in his book, The Meaning of Stoicism, he tells us what distinguishes the sage from a regular Stoic, right, or somebody else. He tells us, yet the Stoics insist that the sage is endowed with the fourth virtue also, justice. That is knowledge of what to give to others and not to give to them. Or, to put it differently, that he is endowed with benevolence and sympathy. In the same way that we're taught in Freemasonry, the Stoics acknowledge that reason must eradicate both the appetites and the desires. And it's also interesting to note that if we look at the virtues through Aristotelian exemplarism, right? And what that means is Aristotle argued that the best way for you to be able to cultivate virtue is by having an exemplar, or somebody that is exemplifying the virtues, right? Which we have the same thing because we have a morality play. And the central figure in that morality play is somebody that we have to emulate, right? And then we can also look at Platonic self-mastery, right? Which teaches us that the self and its destructive desires and appetites must be extinguished through reason. And the way that we arrive to this is by cultivating virtue, but also utilizing the tools that we are given as we're going through the degrees, right? And if you notice, the tool that you're given as a Master Mason similarly teaches you benevolence and sympathy, right? So you are arriving at that, at being a sage in the Stoic context. Now let's look at some Stoic concepts. Now the Stoics had a concept called cosmopolitanism, right? And we are first introduced to this example of cosmopolitanism by a 2nd century philosopher known as Heracles. And if you see here on the left, this is actually what he introduced to his students called the circles of concerns. And what he was teaching was he had man in the middle of a circle, right? And then each concentric circle was a different level of person or a different type of person that had a relationship to that individual. So you have the self or you have your relatives, you have your fellow citizens, your fellow countrymen, and you have humankind. Now, as an exercise to dispel any invisible barriers between people, Heracles would actually teach his students, he instructed his students to address everyone as either brothers or sisters. And if they were older, he would instruct them to refer to them as aunts or uncles. And what this was, it was to emphasize the closeness that humanity had. We're told that regarding these circles of kinship, we are to become aware of them and of all of their interconnections, striving to conduct ourselves benevolently and lovingly to all within each of the circles. Indeed, striving to draw them all in closer to our innermost circle. In the entered apprentice degree, if we remember, we're introduced to the point within a circle. And what we're told that point within a circle teaches us is we need to keep our passions within due bounds and circumscribe our desires and keep our passions within due bounds. Not only with our fellow brothers, but with mankind as well. So we're not even drawing a distinction between the two, right? So we have to treat all people the same. Now, Socrates, as he explored cosmopolitanism, he would tell his students that we should never, quote, reply to one who asks, "Who is your country?" by saying, "I'm an Athenian" or "I'm a Corinthian," but instead saying, "I am a citizen of the universe." And we can similarly find this concept of cosmopolitanism in Freemasonry, because even though I am a member of Hibiscus Lodge number 275 down in Miami, Florida, I still have the privilege and honor of being able to come here to Sahuaro number 45 to be able to share in fun and fellowship with you all. Next, we have premeditatio malorum, or the Stoic concept of the premeditation of evils, and looking at the Hiramic legend as a cautionary tale. Now, the Stoics liked to practice premeditatio malorum, and what they would do is they would wake up every morning and they would think about the worst possible things that could happen to their lives. But it wasn't meant to be a practice that was morbid. What you were actually doing was you were preparing yourself to avert all negative things that could come to you through that day, right? Through the use of reason. Now in Book 2, Entry 1, Marcus Aurelius tells us, "Say to yourself first thing in the morning, today I shall meet people who are meddling, ungrateful, aggressive, treacherous, malicious, unsocial. All this has afflicted them through their ignorance of true good and evil." The Freemason experiences a cautionary tale that depicts a betrayal from those that are closest. With this depiction, the Mason is taught that we are all liable to a moral and ethical lapse of judgment. And this lapse of being, quote, ungrateful, aggressive, treacherous, malicious, can even figuratively lead to the death of those that are closest to us, especially our brothers. However, we also must keep in mind that all of us are liable to that lapse. That's why in Book 10, Entry 30, Marcus Aurelius warns himself, whenever you take offense at the wrong that is done by another, move on to consider what similar wrong you yourself are committing. Next, we have squaring our actions, or the square, the jewel of the worshipful master, and self-control practice, or Stoic self-control practice. In Book 6, Entry 30, Marcus Aurelius tells us, take care not to be Caesarified or dyed in purple. It happens, so keep yourself simple, good, pure, serious, unpretentious, a friend of justice, God-fearing, kind, full of affection, strong for your proper work. Strive hard to remain the same man that philosophy wished to make you. Revere the gods, look after men. Life is short. The one harvest of existence on earth is a godly habit of mind and social action. The worshipful master, his jewel is the square. And he is reminded that he has to square his actions. Again, not only with the brothers, but with mankind as well. Anybody who has had the pleasure of serving in that role knows that it is oftentimes a very difficult position, right? You can be put in very difficult situations, but at the same time, if you don't check yourself, so to speak, right? This is a position that can ultimately get to our head, right? So we have to moderate our actions. We have to constantly guard our own Westgate when it comes to how we are acting as a worshipful master in the lodge. Now in Book 6, Entry 13, Marcus Aurelius writes that your purple-edged robe is simply the hair of a sheep soaked in shellfish blood, right? This is the most important individual at the time. He's the emperor of Rome, and he is reminding himself that his robe is just a sheep soaked in shellfish, the hair of a sheep soaked in shellfish blood, right? So no matter if you are a worshipful, you have a W next to your name, a right worshipful, this is why we are constantly reminded that there is no higher title that you can receive in the lodge than brother. Next, we have the tessellated floor and the Stoic concept of amor fati, or loving your fate. It's in Book 5, Entry 8, that Marcus Aurelius writes, what happens to each individual is arranged to his destiny. We speak of the fitness of these happenings as masons speak of the fit of squared stones in walls or pyramids when they join each other in a defined relation. Now, the tessellated floor, or the ornaments of a lodge that you are introduced to in the apprentice degree, are the tessellated floor, the indented tassel, right, and the star of divine providence, or the blazing star. Now, the tessellated floor, we are taught, reminds us of human life, which is checkered with good and evil. The indented tassel reminds us of the manifold blessings that are always surrounding us. And the blazing star reminds us of divine providence. Now, the Stoic concept of amor fati, as the Stoics expressed it, was they would take things that were perceived, good and bad, equally. So whether something was perceived as good or something was perceived as bad, they felt that it was ultimately helping them towards their fate, right? And if something was bad and they were able to overcome that, they saw that as, okay, now I know that I can survive through this situation. And the reason why I think that this is similarly represented in the tessellated floor is because as Masons, we know that something important happens on the tessellated floor, right? You take your obligation. And that is the only place that you can take it. You can't take it in any other place in the lodge. And the tessellated floor again reminds us that life is checkered between both good and evil. So we are reminded that we are going to have to constantly deal with this polarity. And this is why Zeno, at the end of his life, he is reported to have said, I now find that I made a prosperous voyage when I was wrecked. Because even though he had been shipwrecked and his life was essentially over, his life had actually just begun. Next, we have the chamber of reflection and memento mori, or knowing your mortality. Now, I know the chamber of reflection is a Scottish Rite thing, right? But there are some objects that are found in the chamber of reflection that are introduced in the Master Mason degree. So it's in Book 2, Entry 11, that Marcus Aurelius writes, you may leave this life at any moment. Have this possibility in your mind in all that you do or say or think. It's in the Master Mason degree that we are introduced to two monitorial emblems, those being the hourglass and the scythe. We are taught that the hourglass represents life and how quickly one passes through it. The scythe represents time and how we are all consumed by it, no matter the status. Now, usually when somebody asks me how old I am, right, I'll tell them, oh, I'm 30. People will say, oh, you have the rest of your life ahead of you. You're good. We don't know that, right? We don't know that. I had actually been scheduled to do a symposium, and there was a good friend of mine who was a brother that wasn't able to attend that symposium. And he had actually reached out and he said, hey, bro, I won't be able to go to the symposium. I'll catch you at the next one. I'm actually going on a cruise with my family. So I'll see you later. Yeah, I'll see you later. Unfortunately, he passed away on that cruise, right? So I think that one of the most important things that the Stoics did was constantly reflect on their mortality. But again, it wasn't to be morbid. What it was meant to do was to instill that motive and that initiative of asking yourself, what am I doing? How am I living my life as a Stoic, as a philosopher, as a Mason? What am I contributing? How am I bettering my situation for myself, for other people? How am I building my lodge, right? And I think that this is equally valuable in Freemasonry because we can constantly think about our own mortality in such a way, right? Not only for ourselves, for our lodges, for our family members as well. And I think that this is something, even in going through these Scottish Rite degrees, that is similarly expressed, right? That's why in Book 6, Entry 24, Marcus Aurelius writes, Alexander of Macedon and his muleteer were leveled in death. Either they were taken up into the same generative principles of the universe, or they were equally dispersed into atoms. Now next is possibly my favorite part of the presentation, because this is something that I do regularly in my life, which is journaling, right? So one of the things that I notice is that it's almost like we constantly have to prepare ourselves in life for other people to get to know us, right? If we have a resume or a LinkedIn account or Facebook, how we promote ourselves. But I don't think that we're ever really taught how to know ourselves, how to meet ourselves, right? Now, journaling, much like Marcus Aurelius used it to address himself, and much like other Masons, like Brother Mark Twain, Oscar Wilde, have historically used it to address themselves. And it allows one to engage in a dialogue with himself. Another brother who actively journaled was Brother Winston Churchill. And he once wrote to himself, every night I try myself by court-martial to see if I have done anything effective during the day. I don't mean just pawing the ground. Anyone can go through the motions, but something really effective. Another brother who similarly used journaling or writing is Brother Benjamin Franklin. Now, Brother Benjamin Franklin, at one point in his life, said that what he wanted to do was attain moral and intellectual perfection. But there was only one way that he could attain this moral and intellectual perfection. And what he needed to do was to cultivate virtues. And there were 13 specific virtues that he said he needed to integrate into his life to be able to feel like he had finally attained that moral and intellectual perfection. And these are the virtues. Number 1, temperance. Eat not to dullness. Drink not to elevation. Number 2, silence. Speak not but what may benefit others or yourself. Avoid trifling conversations. Number 3, order. Let all your things have their places. Let each part of your business have its time. Number 4, resolution. Resolve to perform what you ought. Perform without fail what you resolve. Number 5, frugality. Make no expense but to do good to others or yourself. Waste nothing. Number 6, industry. Lose no time. Be always employed in something useful. Cut off all unnecessary actions. Number 7, sincerity. Use no hurtful deceit. Think innocently and justly, and if you speak, speak accordingly. Number 8, justice. Wrong none by doing injuries or omitting the benefits that are your duty. Number 9, moderation. Avoid extremes. Forbear resenting injuries so much as you think they deserve. Number 10, cleanliness. Tolerate no uncleanliness in body, clothes, or habitation. Number 11, tranquility. Be not disturbed at trifles or at accidents common or unavoidable. Number 12, chastity. Rarely use venery, but for health or offspring, never to dullness, weakness, or the injury of your own or another's peace or reputation. And in the same way that Zeno had done many, many, many years ago, humility, imitate Jesus and Socrates. Now, in order for Brother Benjamin Franklin to keep track of the virtues that he had cultivated or integrated into his life, he developed what we know of now as the page of virtues. And this is an example of how his page of virtues would look. Right? So horizontally, he would have the day of the week. And then vertically, he would have the virtue that he had cultivated that particular day. But what's interesting to note is that he included this page of virtues in his autobiography, because what he wanted to do was to leave his autobiography for his son, so that his son could then read it and emulate what he himself had done, essentially leaving behind a tracing board for his son as an initiate of the world. Now, the Stoics understood that life was a struggle between vice and virtue. And this same impression is actually made on the newly obligated entered apprentice. If one makes a distinction between the north and east of the lodge, the north, we're told, is a place of darkness, while the east is a place of light. So essentially, the north is a place of ignorance, and the east is a place of enlightenment. And the entered apprentice is between the two. So I ask you all, how far are you from attaining moral and intellectual perfection? In our Mentor's Manual, which is applied by the Most Worshipful Grand Lodge of Free and Accepted Masons of Florida, a distinction is made between the Master Mason degree and the degrees of Entered Apprentice and Fellowcraft. We're told that in the first two degrees, architecture was the theme of our symbolism. In the degree of Master Mason, our symbols are of a different character. They speak of life, its tragedy, and of its ultimate triumph if we attain virtue. So I ask you all, if we know that the builders can only erect a lodge by using perfect ashlars, how strong are our individual ashlars for both our lodges and our communities? Thank you. So before we head into any questions that you might have, I just want to point your attention to some things. After I had given this presentation, I had actually given this presentation for a Castle Island Virtual Lodge. At the time, Right Worshipful Roger Beatty was the master, who is now the Senior Grand Warden, the Grand Lodge of Arizona. I was able to do the presentation for the Grand Lodge of Canada in the province of Ontario, and a brother was inspired by the presentation, and he actually developed a journal that you can give to initiates, right, where they can document their journey. No secrets. They won't write any secrets. But what the journal calls on them to do or charges them to do is, for example, what are some important lessons that you learned from X degree, right? Entered Apprentice, Fellowcraft, whatever. What lodges have you visited? Do you plan on taking part in any events, why or not? Things like that, just so that they can document their journey. If you're interested in purchasing any of them, if you're interested in purchasing this journal, you can go to thefirst3knocks.com to purchase it. I also had the pleasure of writing the forward, so that was an awesome thing to be able to do. I also want to direct you to the Southern California Research Lodge. If you're not familiar with them, they publish amazing things, an issue every month on a different topic. I had the pleasure of being the guest editor for their June 2021 issue on Stoicism and Freemasonry. So I was the guest editor. I also contributed some works, and that year it was actually voted one of the Fraternal Review's top 3 issues of 2021. So that was also super cool to hear. And that's it, my brothers.